Welcome to the Derek Loudermilk Show. This is episode 335 with Dr. Diana Hill. Dr. Diana Hill, PhD, is the author of the ACT Daily Journal, which is out now, and that's Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. She's also the host of the popular Psychologist Off the Clock Process. And this is a good episode for you if you ever get stuck in your day-to-day challenges, you've ever lost sight of what's really important, and you want to roll with the punches of things that are getting thrown at you. And this is, I think, especially important as so many things are changing. And so this acceptance and commitment therapy, of which she is a practitioner, it brings people more psychological flexibility. So in this episode, we're going to learn some of the basics of ACT, apply some of these exercises from her book, The Daily Journal, to examples in my own life. So you can hear it being used and be able to see why putting these processes into play in your own life can be so powerful, and the power of psychological flexibility. This conversation also ranges very broadly to biomechanics and yoga, to homesteading and bees, how to train ourselves to think outside the box, what it means when we're no longer connected to the decomposing systems in nature. So many things. Dr. Hill is very interesting and well-versed in many topics. So I think you're going to thoroughly enjoy this conversation. Here is Dr. Diana Hill. Dr. Diana Hill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a treat to be here.
And we're going to be talking a little bit about your new book and your work in general. The ACT Daily Journal is just coming out, should be coming out when this episode is released. How'd you get into that work?
Sure. Well, I'm going to first say it's ACT, which is kind of cool in that ACT is pronounced as one word, and there's a little play on words there in terms of ACT daily, in that we hope that it helps you act daily to build a more values-rich life. And I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist, but really my interest in psychology travels way back before then. And I actually have my own recovery history from an eating disorder. And part of my recovery history was moving into more Eastern-based approaches. I studied with Thich Nhat Hanh, and also studied a lot of yoga when I was in college. And then I went on to a degree in clinical psychology to pursue eating disorders. But what I found is that when I was there, it wasn't quite the right fit for me, because I was interested in some of these more Eastern principles. And I actually ended up stepping out of my program to go pursue yoga. And Derek and I we were chatting. I was at Boulder, maybe at the same time you were. I was there for 10 years, but luckily I went to a graduate program that was in like a spiritual Mecca. And so I went to the El Dorado Mountain Yoga Ashram, right up there in the Flatirons, the beautiful Flatirons.
Oh, cool.
And found my home again, back in some of these, practices of effort and surrender and acceptance. But what was cool is that I ended up deciding going back to my graduate program, and I wanted to go back to be able to study this combined space of both the science of behavioral psychology in combination with acceptance-based and Eastern-based principles. And at the time, there was just a few treatments that were out doing that. And so I ended up working with a psychiatrist at Stanford and doing a research study with her. But then I found ACT as well along the way. And it was such a good fit because it balances both. It balances the behaviorism and the science. There's tremendous amount of research out there on this methodology, but it also brings in some of the more depth as well as Eastern and acceptance-based approaches to living well.
When you say Eastern-based approaches or Eastern ideas, what would be an example of that?
Well, one example of that is really traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. Many people have heard CBT as a recommended treatment of choice. Something like with your thoughts. In CBT, if you're having a thought like, I'm a loser, some of us, sometimes we have that thought. In CBT, what you would do with it is you challenge that thought, or you try to think a different thought, or you'd say that's a maladaptive thought, change my mind, change my life kind of situation. But in ACT, it's a little bit of a different approach. So instead of trying to change your thoughts or delete your thoughts or get rid of your thoughts, it's making some space from that for them so you can step back for them. So for example, if you had the thought that I'm a loser and you imagine it was on the palm of your hand and you were to put your hand right up to your face, you can do this with me, Derek. Hand up to your face, and then how well can you see me?
I'm just peeking.
Yeah. How well can you see your hand?
Yeah, it's just the whole hand.
Blurry, right? And then if you slowly move your hand away, how well can you see me?
Clearly.
And if you were to turn your mind to go look at your hand, how well could you see your hand?
Also clearly.
Clearly. So we didn't delete your hand. We didn't cut it off. We didn't strap it behind your back. We didn't write a different word on it. We just got some space from it. And that's a very old Eastern practice, of how to get some space from your thoughts. But it's actually been researched and found to be one of these core processes that help us get more wiggle room in our life, more flexibility in our life, called cognitive diffusion. And cognitive diffusion is one of 6 core processes that together develop what's called psychological flexibility, which is really the goal of ACT, to be able to flexibly move towards your values, adapt to life's challenges, pursue what matters to you, even when obstacles get in your way, like your own head, which can be the case, especially if you are an athlete or a high performer or an adventurer. There's going to be a lot of thoughts that are going to get in there, but we can get a little bit of space from them so we can move more freely towards what we care about.
Yeah, fantastic. And I want to get into those 6. But first, I'm kind of curious, because I'm a PhD dropout as well. It sounds like you went back to the same program after some time. You had a yoga interval. Could you talk a little bit about that whole process of leaving and then going back?
Yeah, it was incredibly terrifying. I'd been working very, very hard to get into a PhD program in clinical psychology, and there was only very few people that were selected to this program, and to be willing to give it up was probably one of the hardest professional decisions that I've ever made. But I also knew that I had made a commitment to myself before I went into my program, and my commitment was that my recovery would come first. And in a lot of ways, me saying I'm going to step out of this was keeping that commitment to myself, honoring my own values, right? And so in that willingness to step away from it and be able to take perspective on why is this not working for me, or what do I need for this to work for me, I was able to go back with much more clarity and intention. And it was really a values-based move to go back, because what I realized when I stepped out of it is that I actually want to pursue this thing, but I want to pursue it in a way that feels more aligned with what I care about. And that's where, going back, I was able to think outside the box. I mean, psychological flexibility is about seeing that your mind creates all sorts of limits, creates boxes and limits and stories that we often believe. But if we can get a little perspective on them, sometimes we can get more flexible with them and choose something that's a better fit. So I ended up going back, and I love my advisor that I worked with there. She was fantastic, and she was really open and willing for me to pursue, sort of shifting my direction a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I love that concept of thinking outside the box, and noticing that you're in a box is one of the first things. And it can feel like super stressful to approach the edge of that box or to step outside of it. So it sounds like you took a different trajectory once you went back into the program.
Yeah, I took a different trajectory, and I love what you said. Noticing that you're in a box is the first step. That's so beautiful, and that is one of the things that boxes us. As I mentioned, self-stories, but another one that boxes us is something called emotional avoidance. And emotional avoidance is avoiding the stuff that shows up under our skin, like I'm scared, or I'm lonely, or this isn't a right fit, right? And so a lot of times what we do is we just avoid those feelings by staying in situations that actually aren't right for us. because it's really scary to step outside the box. And in ACT, I mentioned one of the core processes. Another of the core processes has to do with willingness. And willingness is actually one of our greatest superpowers, I think, of humans, as humans. When we are willing and when we are curious and when we practice acceptance, we can then be able to step into a lot of stuff. We can step into life, because the nature of life and anything that really matters to you in life is that it usually has some degree of discomfort associated with it. So stepping out of the box takes willingness, it takes acceptance, it takes allowing, and it also takes this curious mind, which neuroscience is actually starting to look at as one of the key factors in helping people get unstuck. There's a neuroscientist named Dr. Jed Brewer, who I'm also a podcaster and who I interviewed on the podcast, Psychology Off the Clock. And what he talks about is how even just taking curiosity, a curious stance with our anxiety or a curious stance with our own cravings can help us be able to shift our behavior around our anxiety or around our cravings, and changes also what's activated in our brain. So I think noticing the box you're in, and then second step is willingness and curiosity.
Mm-hmm. What you're saying, it reminds me of something I've heard Tim Ferriss say that he journals on and finds it useful for himself, which is, what am I unwilling to feel? Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about emotional avoidance, I hadn't thought of that as a box. And this might be before we talked, I came up with a few examples in my life where I was like, oh, maybe I was not flexible. Maybe I wasn't emotionally flexible. So maybe we could even use one of these examples, sort of put myself out there a little bit, and you could say like which of these parts of ACT could we apply to this. So here's an example. We were living in Portugal. We took a road trip over to Sevilla, Spain, to see Spain. The rest of my family had never been to Spain. And I had all these plans. There's a bunch of cool stuff to see in Sevilla. Like, we had 3 days. You could probably spend several weeks, exploring the whole thing. So you have to choose. But unfortunately, it was really, really hot when we got there, and we had a little baby. And so all of a sudden, all the stuff that we could do in the middle of the day, like seeing the beautiful gardens and palaces, like you just couldn't reasonably be out in the middle of the day. And then there was a lot of lines and all these things. And so I found myself getting really, really stressed out because I was having to choose between keeping my sort of family cool and healthy and then like not getting to see all the things I wanted to. And, it ended up leading to lots of little arguments between me and my wife. And so it was just, I felt like I really didn't do a very good job. And I still haven't fully sort of understood exactly why that is. So let you take it from there.
Okay, so such a good story, and I imagine we can all relate to it in some way or another. We have our own story going on in our head of how we could relate to that. And there's two things that show up for me as you tell that story. One is that humans are planners and rule followers, and we create a plan for ourselves, and where inflexibility shows up is when we're like, I'm going to stick to this plan, right? We've seen that with, also, small things, but also bigger things like adaptability during COVID, right? Like, I'm going to stick to this plan. No, we actually need to shift the plan here, right? So that could have been also part of it, is rigidly following a rule that your mind made and not being willing to get a little more flexible, step out of the box and see that there's other possibilities. But the other thing that I tuned into was values, because I'm hearing in there that you didn't act in the way that you wanted to act with your family. And when we think about values, or the way that I think about values in the ACT model, is values are qualities of action. They're not things like I value my family or I value travel. It's the qualities that you bring, the verbs and the adverbs that you bring to your family, how you act when you're with your family. If someone were video cameraing me and I could watch that video and say, yeah, that's the person that I want to be like around my family. That would be me aligned with my values. So I'm hearing in there potential out of alignment with your values, in particular with your family, and then maybe some rigidity around holding on to some plan. Does any of that fit for
Yeah. And I consider myself to be an adventurer. And so one of my values is being like super open and on the whim. But as an adventure, like as an expedition planner, like I'm also like, I plan for all kinds of contingencies. I, make sure we're safe in all conditions. And so there's like, then I feel like I'm forcing myself to be a bit of a rule follower in some ways.
Well, I would say there's a difference between being prepared and having a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And my brother-in-law, he designs the brains of robots. So he worked first with like military robots, and now he's designing the brains for driverless cars. And we've had this really interesting discussion about the difference between being prepared versus planning. If you have a plan, you are following say you're an adventurer, so you're following the trail. Right? And then what happens when there's a big log in front of the trail? You're like, oh no, this is my trail. I was on this trail. This is my plan, right? If you are prepared, you brought your compass and your topographic, you brought your map, right? So you can follow the trail, but if there's a log in front of the trail, you have your compass, you have your map, you can figure out another route. Right? And that's where psychological flexibility comes in. And that's actually just sort of the cognitive flexibility component of it, is that life often doesn't go as planned. And I'm sure as an adventurer, you know that, but you feel prepared and willing to adapt, willing to evolve, willing to change as life changes with you. But staying true to, using that same map metaphor, staying true to your values would be like, how do I want to be on this trail, and where am I going? What's important to me about doing this in the first place? So even in your example, I even hear maybe two different values that were showing up, of wanting to go and see and be an adventurer in Spain, and then also the value of your family and being kind and respecting their needs and your little baby's needs. And the question I would have for you is that, would it be possible to live out both of those values? And then what could be a creative solution that probably is sort of more of a dialectic, right? More of a many different ideas coming together that could have ended in a way that you felt more like you acted how you want to be in the world.
Yeah. And you're right on, it sort of naturally solved itself. We just did more like evening and nighttime adventuring.
There you go.
And that actually was more restful, because if you're not walking around all day, then you can walk around for a couple hours in the evening and you're still fresh. And so it worked out okay in the end. There's an interplay that I'm kind of curious about here, which is something that I guess is a value for me, but it's like, especially something I've been working on for myself, is when I commit to doing something, moving from like most of the time I follow through to like I always do what I say I'm going to do, so that I can sort of have that trust in myself. And but then there's also there's rigidity there, there's inflexibility there. Could you just sort of talk about the interplay between like commitment and follow through versus flexibility?
Can you concretize it for me? Like give me an example.
Well, I don't know if I said like today I'm committing to do a workout no matter what, and then or with business, like I'm committing to get this podcast out before lunchtime, or I'm committing to send that person that email response by the end of business, or whatever, just following through on a commitment. And then requests come in from family, from other things, and it's like, well, it would probably increase my effectiveness or enjoyment of life to just be flexible and sort of blow that thing off. But I'm placing a value on doing what I say I'm going to do, because in the past I've just sort of like ignored things. So there's a sort of a tug of war going on there.
Yeah. such a good question. And I think one thing that may help with this is looking at the difference between process versus outcome variables. So a lot of times when we make commitments to a specific outcome, and we have, like, I'm going to finish the podcast before lunch, or I'm going to do X, Y, and Z workout. And the nature of outcome-based goals is that they can feel both sometimes inflexible, right? But also they can tend to be, once you reach them, you feel like, okay, check mark, I've got it, and then it's gone. Whereas paying attention to process, I really want to engage in spending time today that's committed, focused time on editing the podcast. I want to make sure that I move my body today to take care of my body, build strength, build flexibility, build speed, whatever it is you're working on. And I'm going to commit to that process. And this is where I think time blocking can come in, right? For this amount of time. Wherever I get in the outcome is where I get in the outcome. And some days it will be like, an amazing outcome. Some days it, will just be where it is. But that's where time blocking can help, where you are paying attention to the process during the time blocking, not as much the outcome of where you get to, but then that you can be flexible with your time. You can like accordion it, right? So if your family's needs are high, then you can, increase the family time and decrease the workout time, but you're not getting rid of that. I will say the other thing about this, and what I get really interested in as a mom, because I'm hearing a lot of work-parent conflicts here. And so one of the things that I figured out, and I'm guessing that my kids are older than yours. My kids are not older than you. My kids are older than yours. Is that I engage in a lot of what's called like value stacking, or what I call value stacking. And the word stacking actually came from this biomechanist that I follow, that everyone should follow, named Katie Bowman, who is amazing, but she's all about movement and stacking movement. But the way that I value stack is I try and look at ways in which I can engage in some of these values together. So for me, with my kids and working out, my kids basically work out with me. I have a almost 12-year-old, and he does sprints with me when I do my high intensity interval training. When they were babies, my husband and I would be doing down dogs, and they'd be like crawling on our backs, right? And my workout was not the same. I will tell you, it was not the same. But what was enriched for me was that I was able to be with my kids and also be able to engage in movement and have it be, and let go a little bit of it about having it to be a certain way. So tending to the process. Now, I'm not saying everyone should do that, because for some people, going and working out is their me time and they need to do that. But thinking about creative ways, because even, right now, there's creative ways to solve problems that can meet more of your needs and your values than you think, right? And some of them may be, for example, just 2 days ago, I homeschooled my kids. Tuesday, homeschool. I hadn't moved that day. We decided that we were going to go for a walk, and we were going to do science, 2 truths and a lie. And so we're walking, and we're doing our science while we walk. And I got to go to, see the mountains and then walk back. So there's creative ways to get around some of this stuff, but that's where we need to unlock some of our rules and outcomes a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know I really love that. And I have sort of one example of that, which is my kids are little, they're 2 and 4. So I put them in the trailer behind the bike. And, it was just, we have these short little steep hills in my neighborhood all summer long last year, up and down the hills, short little steep hills. I ended up winning the state championship because of all the time I pulled them up the hills.
There you go. Yeah, that's value stacking right there. It's values rich living, because your kids are involved in it, and it's values rich for your kids too, because they're also seeing their dad doing something that he loves and seeing that you don't have to give that up. You do have to maybe change and be flexible with it. It's not going to be the same after you have kids. If there's anything that makes you psychologically flexible, it's children. Forced psychological flexibility. Yeah. But it's great, because we need to get more flexible. We actually become more inflexible as we age. So it's great for us. It's great for our brains and and helps us build, just richer lives. There's good research on parents that they don't report being any happier than non-parents, but they do report having a greater sense of meaning.
Mm-hmm. What was the name of the biomechanic person?
Katie Bowman.
Katie Bowman. Okay.
Bowman, and she actually is coming out with a book right in May she's written like 8 books, but her May one it's called Grow Wild, and it's about how to build more movement-rich kids. And you'll even notice Katie's influenced me a ton. I'm sitting on the floor, and so I'm about yoga. I love yoga, right? But then I sit for a living. I'm a therapist. I sit for many hours a day. And one of the things that I learned about this sort of values-rich living was, okay, if I'm going to sit all day, I'm going to sit in a position on the floor where I can stretch my legs to the side, and I could have a stretch this way. I could stretch my legs forward. I can squat up and down, right? So all of a sudden I'm building yoga into my sitting. Right? As opposed to being on a couch all day, which would probably not be great for my back or for my body in the long term. So just little simple things like that. And that's just a values-based move for me. For somebody else, building values into their life may be different from movement, but there's lots of different ways we can go about it.
Yeah, and there's a parallel here to something that I talk about on the show, which is skill stacking, and the concept of, you combine being good at yoga and psychology and parenting and these other things, like all of a sudden you're the only person in the world that has this one specialty, and you can be sort of much more rare and valuable when you stack these skills together. So that's really interesting. So we've mentioned. Now, I'm not sure exactly which ones we have mentioned, so maybe we could just say what all the 6 are right now.
Yeah. Okay. For the curious minds, it's something called the Zagarnek Effect in psychology. When you only get a little bit of information, you want to know what the rest of it is. So hopefully listeners want to keep listening because they haven't heard all 6. But a little bit of the Zagarnek Effect. They use it in marketing a lot. But okay, so we've talked about cognitive diffusion, which is your capacity to notice your head saying a whole lot of things all the time. Even as you and I are talking, Derek, your head is saying things, my head is saying things, the listeners' heads are saying things. That's just what our brain does. It produces thoughts. So being able to step back from your thoughts, especially the ones that are pushing you around, bullying you, and heading you in directions that you don't want to go. Seeing your mind is not the authority of you. The second one that we talked about is acceptance. Getting curious, opening up, and allowing. And I use those words sometimes more than acceptance when I'm working with clients or I'm coaching someone, because acceptance has this sort of quality to it that we think it means approval or liking something. But really, we're not talking about approving or liking of anything. We're actually talking about just allowing what is. And it's actually when we allow something that we don't like to be what is, we can actually start to take action, right? So acceptance is the second one. And then the third one is values. We've just talked about some values around parenting and how you want to be as a parent. I kind of cluing in a little bit. You want to be present and take care of these little kiddos and also be fun. I heard of you kind of, as you were describing that, you sound like a fun dad. That's something maybe you care about. And also adventurous. And then, okay, so we got 3 more. This is where I have to test I wrote a book on this, but I can't always remember when somebody's asking me. Okay, so now we have perspective taking, which is a fantastic skill and actually something that you should start training in your kids now. I do a lot of perspective taking training with my kids. So perspective taking is your ability to step back and see your own self story. Take perspective on yourself. Perspective taking also has to do with being able to get behind the eyes of another. And it's at the cornerstone of, it's really at the base of empathy and problem solving and collaborative communication. Because when you can take perspective on your own story and then also get behind the eyes of another and see their perspective, all of a sudden your relationships get a lot healthier, and so does your work environment, and then so does also your relationship with your, being a parent. Now, kids can't do a whole lot of perspective taking until they have theory of mind, which is a little bit later, so you don't have to quiz them on this yet. But in our family, I incorporate a lot of these skills into my parenting and into like our dinner table conversations. And I will say things like, if you were me, what would you be what do you think I'd be feeling right now? Or when somebody's talking about a conflict that happened at school, if you were him and those were the circumstances that you were experiencing, what would you feel? What do you think you'd be thinking? What would be your experience? So practicing perspective taking is incredibly helpful. Okay, so then we have the fifth one, which is being present. Okay, we all know that's important. It's important to be present, but also to be present in the places that matter most to us. So a lot of times we expect ourselves to be present all the time. I can get really successful at that when I'm on a retreat or I'm in a quiet space.
Sure.
It's hard to do that in our daily lives. What we can do is get present where it matters, and we can get out of our heads and into our body and into the moment and notice the sensations, some interoceptive awareness of what's happening in our bodies, awareness of what's around us, right? And then just even aware of other humans, right? So when we're more present, we're better able to break up patterns and be more effective. And then the last one we kind of alluded to, which is committed action. And committed action is about getting clear on what's important to you and then taking action, not just thinking about it, but doing it. And committed action has a lot of behavioral principles behind it. So it's usually small little steps that you use behavioral reinforcement with. And the type of committed action that we do in ACT is committed action that's reinforced because you're doing something that's values aligned, and values are intrinsically rewarding. Just by the nature of acting on your values and savoring that feeling of I'm being how I want to be in the world, as one of my co-hosts, Jill Stoddard, would say, the me that I want to be, that reinforces the behavior that we want to grow. So those are the 6 processes, and together they build what's called psychological flexibility.
Fantastic. I want to ask you, in particular, you were talking about the presence and the getting in, feeling your body. And I realize as a trained yoga practitioner that might be one that you're sort of innately even sort of more dialed in to, the awareness of the sort of presence through physicality.
Yeah, it came from yoga and also came from recovering from an eating disorder, because the route to recovery for me was interoceptive awareness and appetite awareness and hunger and fullness awareness, and getting out of rules and shoulds and getting into what my body, like listening to my body. Am I hungry? Am I full? Right? And that's actually what my early research was on at the University of Colorado. I was studying interoceptive awareness, hunger and fullness, appetite awareness, and treating bulimia in particular. So we in the West we're pretty disembodied. And our culture reinforces disembodiment, right? It reinforces us, spending a lot of time in our head and problem solving. And almost like a lot of times when I work with people, they feel like they're just completely cut off from their natural intelligence, which is their body. Our bodies tell us really important stuff all the time. So tuning in for me was, yes, both like spiritual, but also just really being able to heal some behaviors that were really unhealthy for me. Yeah.
I was walking barefoot yesterday out in my backyard, and I've been wearing shoes all winter. And I had this experience of my feet didn't seem as sensitive as they should be. I was like, why am I not getting the sort of like ground feedback feeling? And that disembodiedness, sort of, I felt like, wow, like, and it's the same with like how to tell exactly how full you are, or whether you're actually thirsty or full, these subtle little things.
I love that, because what you're also alluding to there is that a lot of the way that our world is set up disconnects us from nature. And so when we're disconnected from nature, we also forget that we are nature. Nature is not something separate from us, as well as like things like going barefoot to allow your foot to do what it fully does. Going back to Katie Bowman, this isn't a Katie Bowman plug podcast, but she's taught me a lot. There's sort of 3 human needs. Like humans need to hang, we need to squat, and we need to walk, right? And how much of us do any of 3 of those, right? But the reason why is because evolutionarily, that's what we would do. We're not that far off. If you look at like a phylogenetic tree I'm teaching this in my homeschool right now, so I'm kind of into science and evolution. If you look at phylogenetic tree, humans left monkeys like really, really recently, right? We have a long history of hanging, squatting, and walking. So that's where I think that part of getting embodied is also remembering who we are. And there's ways in which we can remember who we are. We can do that by slowing down. We can do that by being in nature. We can do that by listening in a little bit more and tuning in more to our body's natural wisdom.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, that our if we're sitting in our office and surrounded by walls, we're in a box, we're thinking inside of a box, and what you see around you, what you're paying attention to. If you're not paying attention to nature, then all the sort of pile of plastic in the ocean and all these things, like, they're not really in your awareness. And so it's easy to have systems and corporations set up that just have these unintended consequences. So yeah, I love that you're, if we remember that we're nature, large mammals, then the outcomes of all our systems end up being more aligned, I think.
We can learn a lot from nature and ecosystems and seeing ourselves as part of ecosystems. I'm actually a bee guardian. So I have a little homestead here in Santa Barbara, and we have chickens and bees and an orchard and gardens and stuff. But what's cool about bees is that each of the little bees has their own job. So there's like the bees that go out and get pollen. There's the guardian bees that protect the door from yellow jackets. And then there's the nursery bees, and all their job is just to like take care of all the babies, even though they're not their babies, they're the queen's babies, right? So they all have their jobs. But what's interesting is when you become a bee guardian, you learn that you're supposed to give your hive a name. And even though there's 50,000 little species inside of this hive, you give it a singular name. So we have like Norman the hive, because they work synergistically. They work as a whole, and they need to work together. They're completely interdependent upon one another. So we can look at that metaphor in terms of us as humans, like actually literally we are completely interdependent upon each other. And this past year has taught us a lot about that, just our food system and, how interdependent we really are. But we can also look at that within our own mini ecosystem of ourselves, right? So our mental health is interdependent with our physical health. Our microbiome is interdependent, with our immune system, like all these ways in which we're interdependent. And with psychological flexibility and ACT, I would say even these 6 core processes are interdependent with each other, that in order to be present, all of a sudden our values are going to start to show up. And when our values start to show up, there's going to be pain that starts to show up. And when pain starts to show up, all of a sudden we need acceptance and willingness to experience pain. So these 6 core processes also work together like a hive, and they're interdependent. Our psychology is interdependent on these sort of 6 processes that work together.
That's a fantastic analogy. Thank you for sharing. And you mentioned having a little homestead, and we're talking about resiliency and flexibility. And I think, the idea of homesteading and being resilient in many ways, like emotionally, but financially, food resilience, water resilience, all these things. Like, I think the pandemic, at least for myself and other people, sort of had us asking, is our government resilient? Is our healthcare system resilient? Like a lot of these questions, or even can it be anti-fragile? And, so there's a question there that I'm trying to put together, but just
I can just respond to it. You don't have to ask.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So resiliency is an interesting one, and having a homestead is connected to that, because one of the reasons why we created this homestead is because I wanted to feel like we could live on our own if we needed to. Now, we really couldn't live, really couldn't, but it's only so many eggs and honey you can eat and kale, right? But what it created for me was a sense of security of like, wow, I'm putting something into the ground and I'm taking something out of the ground, and I'm sort of biodynamically, taking care of this land in a way that it works. Humans are really good. If you look at ecosystems, humans are really good at producing, and they're really good at consuming. But they're not so good about that third part of an ecosystem, which is decomposing. And the decomposing part is the full circle, right? Of being able to see, to close the loop. And so the psychology version of that is that humans are also really good at producing content and consuming content, but we're not very good at decomposing. And what is decomposing in the psychology realm? It's pausing, resting, receiving, having space and silence in our conversations. So I think of ecosystems on the, sort of the micro level and the macro level, and it all fits together in my brain. I hope it fits together in other people's brains when I'm talking about this, but it fits together in my mind as like a big model that we could use to understand, okay, especially as we're coming out of COVID, what is it? What is my ecosystem? What did I learn about which parts were missing and which parts I needed to build back in? A lot of people, when everything shut down initially, they had a secret, thank gosh. I don't have to go to this. I don't have to go to that. I can stay home for a week. There was a little bit of relief and horror, and fear, and they both can happen at the same time. That's okay. But look at that relief. What was that about for you? What was the decomposition that you were needing that you weren't getting? And then look at what was scary for you, because what was scary for you points to your values as well. What were you afraid of losing that matters to you? And the other part of it is, what were you kind of like okay about losing? And then you realize that didn't really matter to me as much.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Thinking of decomposing as psychologically. So there's something I'm experiencing right now. Actually, it's kind of interesting, timely for me. A lot of projects in my business and work have just sort of wrapped up. Just sold a house, just finished a year-long mastermind, just sort of like I have a lot more space in my schedule in the last few weeks, all of a sudden, starting actually this week. And I feel like there's a little bit of a pivot, a little of a opportunity for me to sort of like do my next big thing, my next creative project, like maybe, like the equivalent of a PhD, like a multi-year journey towards a big thing in the world. And I struggle with the sort of like, I need to be learning a lot and consuming and preparing. And then sometimes I force myself just to like lie down and do nothing and like force myself to be okay with just being. So it's kind of an edge for me just to like wander around aimlessly, for example.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of, I would say, potential emotional avoidance there in doing and striving. And striving is something that I've gotten really interested in because my own history of striving. I mean, an eating disorder is like, you're like an Olympian of striving if you can get yourself down to a crazy low weight, right? So the nature of when we strive and we keep doing and we're trying to fill the spaces, but because it's uncomfortable to sit in the spaces, I think that that's something to look at. And I also think that striving can be a really beautiful thing when we're striving towards values-rich goals, things that matter to us, things that you feel like you're offering in the world. So my guess is that probably both of those would be of benefit to take a moment to look at it, like, what's so uncomfortable about being here? Because there's a lot on your plate, Derek. You have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. There's plenty. Like, you could do nothing and you would have plenty. There's the business of living. Mm-hmm. And the business of living and just sort of like the chop wood, carry water of life is actually how humans lived for many, many years, right? Our work was our family, and our family was our movement, and our food was our movement. We moved to get food. Now we move to get rid of food. So it's really interesting to think about sort of these ways in which we think we need to go do something. And I think there's also, I've gotten really interested in this. There's a type of therapy called compassion-focused therapy, and Debbie and I include a little bit of this in the first chapter of the book, and we call the first chapter Preparing the Ground, Creating Nutrient-Dense, Nutrient-Rich Soil before you start learning new skills. And the Preparing the Ground component of the book was about 3 things. It was about compassion, self-care, and intentional use of time. And the compassion part was based on this researcher's work, Paul Gilbert, who's from the UK, the Compassionate Mind Foundation. And what he talks a lot about is how to cultivate the part of our brain and our body that helps balance out our threat and drive system. Because our threat and drive, especially I think in high performers like you, Derek, you got a lot of drive. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with having a drive system. That's how you win awards and how you win races and how you go through adventures. But it can get out of balance and it can actually lead us to feeling dissatisfied, because we need to also have contentment. We also need to have a space where we feel soothed and compassion and contentment and nurtured. And, that's the decomposition, I guess, of the ecosystem. And that would be maybe a place to explore before you start going into drive again.
Thank you. Yeah. Is there a particular exercise in the book that or one of the days that I should look at for that?
Well, I think a really great place to start in the book is this 3-circle diagram. And listeners could even do this in their mind or do it on a piece of paper, where you start by thinking about these 3 systems: threat, like what makes you feel afraid. You want to fight, flight, freeze, adrenaline, epinephrine, amygdala, threat. And then we have drive, and then we have soothing. And you start with drawing a circle of each. How big is your threat system right now? How big is your drive system right now? Like what size would that circle be? And then how big a circle would your soothing system be, or your content system be? And many times people find that like one circle is really big. And it's often not the soothing content one, I'll just say. It's not the satisfied, I feel complete, I feel enough, I have enough, I am enough, there is enough. That's the content system, and oftentimes we don't feel that. So when you get a sense of the size of these, you can start to look at 3 things. You can look at, what are the things in my life that are activating this system? What's activating my threat system right now? What's activating my drive system? What's activating my contentment system? And we can think about those as being things outside of ourselves or inside of ourselves, because we can activate our own drive system by our own feelings of not enoughness, right? Mm-hmm. And then I like to look at, because I like embodied based practice, what does it feel like in my body when I'm in those 3 systems? How do I know the difference? When I'm in threat, what does it feel like? Is it energy rising? Or is it closing down? Or is it, fleeing and fighting? What does it feel like in my body when I'm in drive? Right? And then what does it feel like in my body when I'm in content? Safeness. The third thing I have people look at is, what do I do? How am I acting in a way when these systems get activated for me that keeps them going, that reinforces them, right? And so we can think about, what are the things when I'm in drive and I'm in overdrive, I tend to speak more quickly. I rush through things. I add things to my schedule, and it just makes me more in drive. When I'm in threat, I tend to shut down. I isolate. I don't talk to people. And that just makes me feel more threat. And then what are the things that I could do that would help cultivate more of a sense of security, safety, compassion? And that's often sort of like slowing down our breathing, being with someone we love, practicing compassionate, encouraging talk to myself, being in nature for me, like in the garden. So things like that would maybe help you with your contentment system. And then once you have those questions answered, you can start to look at, through your day, where am I at? Scale 1 to 10, am I in threat? Scale 1 to 10, am I in drive? Scale 1 to 10, am I in contentment? And what do I need to balance these out a little bit more? I'm giving the example of a high drive, but I work a lot with clients that are also depressed, and their drive is through the floor. So I need to up their drive. We need to up the behavioral activation. We need to say, okay, we're going to get more action into your day because there's not enough. But the sense I have of you, Derek, is that there's too much.
You must be good at what you do. That's fantastic. Super. And thanks for playing with these sort of examples. Obviously, you're helping me, but I think it's helping everybody listening and watching. We just got a couple minutes left. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you think is important to mention?
Yes, there's so many things we haven't talked about, but and I hope that we kind of went off the rails a little bit from ACT here, but that's good. So I guess I just want to mention what the book is. If you feel like I was all over the place, it's because I am, and because my brain does that, and I just let it go when I'm having fun. But I think that the book is really great, and that I got organized. My co-author is Debbie Sorensen, who is quite organized, and she reined me in from these B stories. And it has 8 weeks that you work on psychological flexibility. You start with week 1, preparing the ground. You move through the 6 skills 1 week at a time, and each week has a little story because humans learn well through stories. And each week also has sort of the concrete research-based skills that you would learn in this psychological flexibility as well as a journal prompt to really personalize it and practice it. And then the last week is integration. And you can enter in at any point, anywhere you want. We wanted it to be flexible. So if you just want to go in and just do the values week and you want to do the values week for a month, go for it. But it's a nice manual and program to help you walk through some of these ideas and really have you try them on in your daily life, because I really believe that embodied practice in our daily life is where it's at, right? It's not just like thinking about going to something and learning something for a weekend and then coming home and like, what does this mean when my kids are having a meltdown at 5? I don't even know how to apply this right now. So we want to apply it to your living as it is.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I love that it's so it's accessible. You know, when I opened it up, I was like, oh, I can just. It's a lot of books feel like a big commitment, but this is great because you can sort of work through it. So,
yes, BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits, Little Things. Yeah.
Well, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming on the show. It was great having you, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today.
Well, thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for being out there doing what you do and being able to spread this word with others. So take care.
Yeah, thanks.